Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing how City of Seattle economists say their proposed capital gains tax could spur a wealth exodus. Spokane's homelessness response proving to be insufficient with winter closing in. And the Washington GOP's response to tyranny in response to Washington Democrats' response to tyranny. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. Washington's largest city saw an initiative to repeal a state capital gains tax had failed. Facing a budget crunch, the city has decided to float a similar tax of their own. But as Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly reported this week, city officials say there's quite the loophole in the proposed tax. First and foremost, Spencer, what are city officials proposing?
So, city officials are proposing a local 2% capital gains excise tax that would be applicable to non-retirement financial gains over $250,000. This is pretty similar to the state's 7% capital gains tax. Seattle City Councilmember Cathy Moore is the prime sponsor of this bill. She said the tax is a solid form of additional revenue because it has been tested both in terms of going through the legal process and it is being upheld at the state level. And don't forget, Initiative 2109 passed by a wide margin. So she said there's a broad public support for this form of revenue. Now, there's a wide range of revenue that city economists have said. It could range from 16 million to 51 million. But that's to be determined, I suppose.
Yeah, a lot of different variables there. And now, what's this loophole you reference?
Yeah, so this tax targets the city's richest residents, right? But it is based on where a taxpayer's permanent residence is located. So Seattle's richest residents, assuming they own multiple homes, can avoid the tax altogether by just moving their permanent residence to one of their other homes, whether in Washington or somewhere else. And that alone just avoids a 6.5 to 9% increase in tax burden if this capital gains tax is approved by the city council.
Yes, from your previous reporting, we've come to call that the Bezos maneuver.
Yeah. So I've covered this multiple times, but since Amazon founder Jeff Bezos left Washington to move closer to family in Florida, he has saved himself hundreds of millions of dollars, and the state has lost hundreds of millions of dollars as well because of this. And that's the one thing that we keep noticing here is that the residents who are subject to these capital gains tax have the ability to just move. And I think that's one of the cons here we're seeing.
Well, and I think what's important is it's not a physical move. I mean, they're not packing up their mansion and putting it into a U-Haul and driving everything, Carmen Sandiegoing their giant home from Seattle to Everett. This is as simple as when somebody wealthy wants to change their residence to another home, they do a couple very specific things like register to vote in the other place, claim the other residence as their primary homestead and collect a deduction there as compared to their home in Seattle. It's not that difficult for them to do. It's a day of accounting, and then they get a lot more things in the mail at their other residence, and they change who they bring their dog to in terms of veterinarian.
And that's basically, Cole, what the Seattle Office of Economic and Revenue Forecast stated. And you don't really see that too often in some of these bills. It's very usually encouraging, but you can definitely see the glaring loopholes here and the possibility that these people can just do exactly what you said, just change their permanent address.
Yeah. And the economists, you got to remember, these are people employed by the city. And these are people that are answering to the people that are proposing this new tax. And they're saying not only is this easy to get around by the people that have the means that would apply to this tax, but it means more than just less revenue for the city if they propose the tax. It means what they call the net loss of economic activity is what they said, correct?
Correct. Yes, you would see state or companies moving out and whatnot. You see loss of economic activity because so many people will just be moving out of the city alone. And that's one thing that was noted as well. Yes.
Yeah, and it's the trope is, well, will somebody think of the yacht builders, right? When you talk about rich people moving their home base and going somewhere else. But it does remain true. People that have a good amount of disposable income do create economic activity, albeit, in smaller numbers than the entire middle class. But something that has come up already at the state level now that the capital gains tax has been affirmed by, voters to not get repealed this time around and proven to be something that's not going to be shot down in the courts. They have said, okay, now this is a relatively small number of taxable people, and you're looking at the ability for them to potentially move. What do they think in terms of the total number is the target? Just how few people are we talking here, Spencer? Sorry for the roundabout question. Sure.
No, well, the statistics are there. Last year, there was 816 taxpayers residing in Seattle that paid the state 7% capital gains tax. Now, these residents are extremely wealthy because out of those 816, the top 20% of them paid a whopping 85.7% of the tax collected for the capital gains tax altogether in the state. Now, if you add on to the city's local capital gains tax, a lot of these residents could just say, enough is enough. I'm going to move. I think you might have some good team sports saying, or team players wanting to contribute in a way to the taxes. But eventually, it seems like what here is Seattle's trying to see what they can get away with. And that's what I was referring to when Cathy Moore said, well, it's gotten a lot of broad support, as we saw in Initiative 2109. So why don't we try this? But I don't know. When I was watching the budget committee meeting, it seemed like city council members were a little skeptical. I can't tell you. I don't know for sure. But some said it seems like a good idea, but not at the right time.
Yeah. And as we have seen, a lot of people will support a message like eat the rich until they are on the dinner table. And, with Mr. Bezos, he's famously progressive, owns a, progressive leaning newspaper out east. But when it rubber hit the road, he decided that he was not going to subject himself to his home state's capital gains tax. And so we'll see how that pans out for Seattle. I'm guessing that cooler heads will prevail in that because of the economic ease in which people that would be the main target could be evading and getting around being taxed that amount. But we will see, and I'm sure you'll track it. Thank you, Spencer. It's getting cold in Washington and the state's thousands of homeless are going to be looking for shelter. In Spokane, Mayor Lisa Brown is working to shift the city's homeless population from a congregate shelter into a different model that she and supporters say is more humane. But Eastern Washington reporter Tim Klauser found this week that the city might have been caught between the two models and now short on housing just as temperatures drop. Is that an accurate assessment, Tim?
Yeah, Cole, I'd say so. Providers and residents across the city have been calling alarms over the upcoming winter, considering the state of the homeless system. Like you said, the city is transitioning away from the sort of warehouse style of housing that's homeless and towards a more humane, individualized approach. But city officials and even the providers have said, it's going to take time, maybe even up to a year. There's 3 scattered sites up right now, which are providing around 170 beds combined. The city said they're in talks talks to open up more, but there's not a hard date on when that'll happen. Meanwhile, the city's largest congregate shelter closed on Halloween, taking hundreds of beds offline that the city had at its disposal last winter.
So, I mean, yeah, you're talking about the Trent shelter. I mean, what are the city's options? Can they just reopen it? Is it, becoming did it become a Spirit Halloween? Is it a Best Buy now? Is there an ability for them to say, okay, well, people are going to be freezing outside, so you're talking a matter of life or death here. Is there a way to reopen the congregate shelter just to say, here's a place? It might not be ideal, but we have something to keep you from freezing to death.
Yeah, I mean, they could hypothetically go back and reopen the Trent shelter, but in operational costs to in the last 2 years, they've spent close to $17 million. I mean, that's not taking into account the around $30,000 in rent that they pay every month for the facility. That is really just not up to code at all. So they want to get out. They want to get away from the style. So they said they're pretty adamant about not reopening the facility. They looked at it as an option for emergency beds, but just decided that the ship has sailed and they closed shop. And some of the city officials are worried about what could come next. They want to stay on top of the bed counts to avoid another crisis like Camp Hope, which a few years ago, Camp Hope once held around 600 people at once. Mm-hmm. And track was one of the solutions to that. They took a bunch of those people and they went to track. But now that track's close, some are worried that they might find themselves in another situation where they're kind of in between the two models right now and they have that lack of beds.
How many beds short are they, and how much money do they need to bridge that gap?
That's a really good question, and it's hard to give a clear answer on both. I mean, we can compare back to a few months ago, back in January when the Spokane did its point-in-time count. It had around 1,600 beds across all of its shelters. And that's when they recorded just over 2,000 homeless people. So you could argue back then that they still didn't have enough beds. Now that bed count is down to around 1,000 now. And the providers are saying that the homeless population is even higher than it was in January. So you have a large
growing.
disparity.
It's not getting less. It's getting more.
Yeah. So, I mean, the city says it needs a lot more funding to tackle this. I mean, how much? We don't really know. It's noteworthy that the vast majority, the city says upwards of 95% of annual funding put towards homelessness comes largely from the state and federal government. They say about 5% comes from local tax dollars. I'm not quite sure on what the hard percentages are at this point, but they did realize in the last few weeks that in the last year, they've put around $3 million in general fund money towards different homeless initiatives. So it just depends on the stance, but they do need more money. They're just not really sure how much more.
Mm. And I mean, it's probably a good estimation of that small of a number coming from the city, because they were relying on a lot of COVID relief funds coming from the federal government that have dried up now. I mean, you're approaching 2025, but is there, pleas to the state? The mayor is the former head of Department of Commerce. Are they now making a play for state tax dollars to shore this up so that they can, complete this new, more humane model and not let people freeze outside in the name of humanity, I guess?
Yeah, that's definitely a goal of theirs. They're definitely vouching for more tax dollars at the state and federal levels, and they do that already. I mean, they were getting tens of millions of dollars from Commerce and from the state when Lisa Brown was director of the State Department of Commerce, and they likely will continue to. They'll keep pushing for more money. And you mentioned the COVID funding aspect. It's important to note that they are still relying on a lot of COVID money. And their last sort of around a little less than $2 million that they had dedicated towards homelessness from that COVID funding is dedicated towards propping up these sites. So they're going to keep asking for more dollars. It's just figuring out how to use those in a better way. They're arguing that, this scattered site model, it might take time to get up and running, but they feel like it'll be a more effective use of the tax dollars. They're not able to house as many in one location, which is a downside, but they're able to take these sort of micro populations of, say, 20 to 60 people with individualized needs and focus on those populations directly. So in terms of funding, the argument goes both ways, but regardless, it's going to take time to really see the impacts of this. Now, there is some upsides in the short term in terms of the bed count. And, it is down to around 1,000 right now, but they are putting more beds online. It's just not as much as they still had back in January. Typically, the city allocates around $250,000 each year for emergency beds during extreme heat and cold. Now, we've talked about this before, and it's only enough to cover a fraction of what the city needs. But Mayor Lisa Brown, she allocated an additional $800,000 in one-time funds for the effort this year, which is bringing the total up to just over $1 million. Now, that's enough to provide another 133 surge beds for a total of 143 nights, which is a perk. But as you can tell from what we've been saying, it's dismal in comparison to the total population.
Right. If you're looking at it, a conservative estimate is 2,000 homeless people in Spokane, and it's probably more with 1,000 beds right now, and the temperature's dropping. I didn't even know if you know the answer to the question, but will homeless people that are on the streets in downtown Spokane that cannot get one of these beds, do you think they'll just leave?
I can't give a hard answer on that, but speaking from what I've seen being on the ground when I am in town and just speaking to different stakeholders and citizens, they don't feel like the homeless are going to leave. For many, Spokane is their home. It's where they were born and raised, and now they're in the situation that they are. And for others, it's a place of refuge. Spokane has a significant housing problem, but at the same time, there's resources for the homeless population there, which might attract people in neighboring states and cities. So the city is kind of just caught between a rock and a hard place here. They can help the homeless people and pray that it gets better as more money is spent, or they can save that money and hope that they just leave, which a lot of the city sees as the more inhumane option.
Leave or freeze, is the face, is the situation that some of these, homeless individuals will face. I don't know where humanity comes into it at that point. You have to look past like the partisan thought and the philosophy behind how you're going to, house people, congregate versus scattered site. It just then becomes a situation where you have to look at this as, can we keep these people from dying this winter? And that it's odd that it just, even, in your reporting and conversations I've heard, on city council, it's like that is, I hope it's top of mind, but at the same time, it's like, it doesn't feel like that's the base of the conversations at this point, as they try and prop up this new model as temperatures start to plummet. It's shocking, but best of luck to them. Thank you, Tim. Washington's Republican Party didn't see many wins on Election Day. All statewide races went to Democrats, but it's not much of a shock in such a deep blue state. With Governor-elect Bob Ferguson set to assume office in January, the minority party, the GOP, is announcing a plan to, quote, battle tyranny. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson covered the announcement. What's the plan, Carlene?
Yeah, that announcement on Tuesday kind of seems, Cole, like it's a warning to the incoming Bob Ferguson administration that basically says, we Republicans in Washington, we might be the minority, but we're watching you. Democrats, of course, see it as like fear mongering. As you mentioned, they're firmly in control in Washington, still holding every statewide executive office, and then, majorities in the House and Senate, adding, in fact, one more Senate seat in this election. So, it seems like this is just one reporter's take on it, but, wanting to ensure maybe the more than 1.3 million Washingtonians who signed on to the ballot initiatives, basically saying to them, okay, we didn't make any gains in statewide offices. We only won one more ballot initiative on November 5th of the 4 that were on there. Ferguson's in office, but we know how to handle him because we've watched him in the AG's office for 12 years. That's kind of my sense of why they're coming out with this now.
It feels like, they're, and I get it. But it feels to me like they're just, the message is, okay, yes, we got ourselves handed to us, a couple weeks ago.
That's the way to put it.
But at the same time, we're still here and we're going to do something to fight this. And it's taking on a more of a guerrilla warfare style, competition to this. The one thing that, Republicans and people who do not support what Democrats plan to do and are doing, the one thing has been initiatives. And I've said, since these were just getting, gathering signatures, I've seen in other states. I'm originally from Illinois. When ballot propositions got too annoying to the majority party, which is Democrats there as well, they simply changed the rules to make it more difficult to annoy them. And the question then becomes, is that Senate Bill 1 when they go back into session with, to try and make sure that they don't have to lean on the state's billionaires and fight an existential battle to maintain some of these signature environmental achievements that they've run through?
Well, and this, Project to Resist Tyranny from Jim Walsh, a Washington GOP chairman, and other party folks, made very clear they're not going to tip their hand in what is going to be their approach. They're saying basically, we know who Bob Ferguson is after 12 years as Attorney General, after 97 lawsuits by Bob Ferguson's office in Trump's first administration, more than any other state, right? They kind of have his playbook. And they also have been, up against Bob Ferguson with this initiative effort for the last couple of years in Washington. So I think it's kind of them saying, we know what his approach is going to be. We're prepared for it. And they're basically saying it's going to start with citizen activism. And I think, again, as I mentioned, that they're trying not to lose those 1.3 million individual Washington voters who signed the one or more of the initiatives, right? They're trying to tell those people, we still need you. Don't go away. We might have gotten beaten and bruised, but we're not going down. We're going to continue the fight. And, some of our readers and listeners to our podcast, Cole, will remember that, Democrats were successful in combating the initiatives in large part with those public investment impact disclosures that were on the ballots, right? And
they were huge. Yeah.
They were huge, and that likely confused a lot of people. And those were written, mind you, by Bob Ferguson and company.
Right.
They were the ones who got to write those. Those appeared on the ballot, and those may have confused voters. I think that was very intentional. At least that's what Republicans argue, in convincing them to reject the measures. And so, a little history too on that whole litigation piece. Washington Republicans they went to the state Supreme Court and tried to get those PIIDs, those public investment impact disclosures, removed from the ballots because Ferguson had written them and they were seemingly partisan. Now, Supreme Court of Washington rejected Republican efforts along those lines, but they didn't reject the merits of the case. What they said is, you filed wrong.
It was you failed by technicality, essentially. Yep. And I think and people talk about the losses of the 3 of the 4 initiatives, and a lot of people have lent the explanation of, well, 1, it's a very, very deep blue state. Okay. 2, you had just a Mount Rainier of cash dumped on, opposition to those ballot measures. But you also saw hearty opposition to the ban of the gas ban, the initiative, what is it, 2066 that passed.
Right.
And 3 other initiatives went before the legislature and they said, we don't want that We don't want that fight. We're not ready for that. So they allowed them to be passed.
Yeah. So
and
4
so
of
you
7.
have 4 of 7
right.
passed and were allowed to become reality and roll back those initiatives. But the only 3 that did not succeed had those PIIDs on them. And so this tells me, if I'm a high-ranking Democrat in Washington, in the back of my head, I'm thinking, I don't want that fight again. And so if you've explained to me before, it takes, in order to change the state's constitution, they would need supermajorities in the House and Senate to ratify a resolution, right?
They would need that supermajority, and there was some hope among Democrats that some of the redistricting that took place in the Yakima Valley, ultimately really impacted the 14th and 15th legislative districts, but there were 13 districts that lost a chunk or gained a chunk based on the redistricting. And there was a fight by Republicans over that they lost as well. But it did not pan out for Democrats as they had hoped. You still have Republicans keeping all of their seats in the 14th and 15th. Now, Democrats in Washington are picking up an additional Senate seat, so they increase their majority, but by no stretch a supermajority. And when I spoke to Jim Walsh, Washington GOP chair, earlier in the week, he said, let him go ahead and try. Let him try to do something to continue to undermine the initiative process in Washington. He thinks it'll fail. I mean, his take was, go for it. He thinks it'll backfire big time. He says it won't be easy. Boy. Yeah. And he says that he thinks moderates and independents, a lot of them that supported some of the initiatives as well, right? That it would backfire. So we'll see. It would take a pretty drastic effort, but I think you're right. I think it is likely to be a fight during the upcoming, 2025 legislative session. And it's going to be, I don't know, as a reporter, fascinating to watch. I can't wait to be in Olympia to see how this one pans out.
I think that, when you're looking at a near super majority and they're looking to get something done and willing to do just about anything to get it, I've seen in situations in the past where the near super minority party has a Judas amongst them that's going to get a governmental post paying 3 times their state salary, and they will surprise everybody by siding with the majority to get what they need through and then walk away a very enriched former lawmaker.
And I wanted to add one more quick note, Cole, that I thought was important along what you just said, the lines of what you just said. You recall, or our listeners and readers recall, in Washington that State Senator Mark Mullet, moderate Democrat, ran for governor, right? Didn't make it past the primary. He's now joined Bob Ferguson's administration in the governor's office. That tells you something right there, that more moderate could end up leaning towards Ferguson's office. That could be another, hitch in the giddy up for Washington Republicans, for sure.
We will see how that all pans out, but good luck to Jim in maintaining his super minority. And thank you, Carlene, and a big thank you to our journalists for sharing their stories. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach, and until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.